Thank you very much. And I realize my bio was far too long. Maybe one sentence is enough. Today I'm going to talk about anaerobic digestion, but quite specifically and quite a narrow field. And I think I might be able to answer some of the questions that were raised this morning. Also, following on from Jane's talk, this is sort of technology transfer from Europe to Australia. And I think that would be quite smart. We don't have to spend a lot in developing this. We can just look at what other people did, what was successful, and then adopt it and adapt it. Okay. Organics processing, primarily composting, really has come a long way in Australia. This has been put together by MRA, just really showing some of the composting facilities around the country. This is the last official survey, which was done 11-12, so 200 facilities, 5.5 million processed. Now it's 6.5 million, somewhere around that. We do have some anaerobic digestion facilities. They're generally wet facilities. That was talked about. I'm not from New South Wales, so I'm not really au fait of what's happening. I'm not sure if there are two or just one operating, but these were still on the web. And particularly here in New South Wales, with the EPA providing money for infrastructure, there will be more composting facilities. There probably will also be more anaerobic digestion facilities. Therefore, councils and service providers really have to look at what technology is best, what suits the specific environment conditions, and particularly the material flows. Tunnel composting has become popular, particularly in New South Wales, because the money is there to do it, the government support is there to do it. These ones are here in New South Wales. That one is Veolia's facility in Bulla, but it has sort of turned out box tunnel composting is the preferred option, and these facilities are being built. But my question is, if you're doing tunnel composting, why not think about tunnel digestion? Pretty much the same as you can see here, doors loaded with a loader, not much different. Some of you might have seen this graph. It's pretty famous. This is the development of anaerobic digestion facilities in Germany. It really sort of, around the turn of the century, it just skyrocketed. 9,000 facilities, 4,000 megawatt, impressive, but most of it doesn't touch really waste management at all. The vast majority are agricultural facilities. They use energy crops, so it's not really relevant for you at all. These are figures 2014, 75 plants processed FOGO, and about 40 were primarily commercial organics. Okay. But this development really had an impact on the organics recycling sector. The green is the composting capacity in million tons, and the gray here is anaerobic digestion. So from around 2007-8, composting wasn't really increasing in capacity. That's sort of as a perception. Composting is always part of the anaerobic digestion, but all these facilities, as the first step, had anaerobic digestion. And today it's about a 60-40 split. Just very briefly, the theory, wet digestion, we talked about that. Dry digestion with 25 to 35% moisture, dry matter, and then dry digestion 30 to 50. And this is really about what comes out of the curbside collection bins. And this discontinuous or batch fermentation processes, they are designed specifically for this type of material. So really, the material flows you have and you're aiming to deal with determines the type of technology, whether it's wet, discontinuous dry digestion, or discontinuous dry digestion. And this is specifically what I want to focus on today. here is the answer to the question about split between dry and wet. This is for Germany. There are currently 17 wet digestion facilities and 46 dry, and they're about equally split between continuous feed and discontinuous feed. We're not in the business of selling any technology, really just presenting it. This is the discontinuous, and Mark Stenberg last year presented on this one. I just want to say this is also a possibility. You may have to add more water, or your whole feedstock does have to have a higher moisture content. But also, there are quite a number of different technology providers. It really has been well developed. A lot of changes, buyouts and whatever in this sector, but there's still 5-6 significant suppliers in Europe. And this is what I want to focus on. They're primarily, I think, based in Germany, but this one is also a US system. So the idea really spreads because it makes sense. At least it makes sense to me. You can also see the system is pretty much the same as tunnel composting. You've got a door. This one is a bit odd shaped, but this is really the gas collection. And this is just a schematic view. This is essentially the box. It's filled with a loader. You're able to irrigate it, to put percolate in it, to keep the moisture content there, but also to introduce the anaerobic bugs who will do the work. This is a collection system for the percolate, so some is circulated. You probably will have some surplus, but not very much. It's heated just in the walls or the floor. Has got a combined heat and power unit attached to it, supplies the heating, but also the energy, the electricity. Just very briefly, the processing stages. The first stage is anaerobic. So essentially, air is being blown in, the normal composting system kicks in, the material heats up, which brings it then to 50 degrees or 60, something like that, and that's the desired processing temperature. The second, and at that stage, air is blown in, but no circulation of percolate or anything. The second stage, you cut off the air supply, you put in the leachate, you introduce the anaerobic digestion bacteria, they get the anaerobic process started, stays like that for probably 2 to 3 weeks. And then the third step is you reverse that. Some of the remaining gas is just flared off, but then you introduce air again, you make it aerobic again, so it's not an odor problem when you open the door and when you take the material out. I forgot to say, during that process, essentially, biogas is generated here in the percolate store, but primarily out of this area, and it's just stored in a big plastic container, flexible one, and then going to the electricity and heat generation unit. Okay. This is a curve of methane and biogas generation. So biogas has about 60% methane, and that's really what you want. And this runs at different temperatures. So if you do it at 50%, you're probably 2 or 3 times as fast as if you do it at ambient temperature around 20 degrees. And that's the reason why it makes sense to heat that chamber, because you do have the heat on site. This is the methane generation curve from 1 unit over 20 days. Obviously, it goes up and then slowly declines. And the aim of these facilities is not to generate maximum yield, maximum gas yield, but really to look for the economic optimum. And the minimum to be able to generate reasonably equal gas flow is you need 4 units, just because it goes up and then slowly down. So this is one of the constraints, but the units, they can be made any size you would like to have. Okay. Biogas yields, and if we just look at garden organics and food and garden organics, it's not ideal, but it's also not too bad. And as many composters do at the moment, if you also have some grease trap waste, if you add some of that, it certainly will improve your yield and your economic viability. And here, this is corn silage. That's what a lot of the farmers in Europe do. So they would be ahead of the game, but still they have to produce that corn and make money out of it. Just some average figures or range figures rather because it really does depend on the feedstock which is processed and to some degree also on the technology. But as a rule of thumb, you can say 1 ton of FOGO, 100 cubic meters of gas at 60% methane, you've got 600 kilowatts of energy. The question arises, how do we utilize the biogas? It's good to generate it, but someone said only makes sense if you've got a use for it. There are, I would call them, aspirational targets. I think here in Australia that might be quite a long way off. In Europe, this is sort of on the verge of happening, feeding it into the public gas supply. This is not too far off. I think Australia, because we do have sort of LNG for cars already, that might be feasible. But most really would have a CHP unit, and that means you're generating electricity and heat. Unfortunately, the split is not what we would prefer. I think we would prefer to have electricity, maybe 80 or 90%, but in a standard CHP, it's almost 50-50 split in heat and in electricity. This, it's relatively easy to utilize. This, it's quite difficult to utilize, and particularly if you've got a composting site that's a long way from any neighbors who could utilize the heat. Here I just put down efficiencies. So the CHP is quite efficient in itself in turning gas energy, chemical energy into electricity and heat energy. You need some to operate the unit, and then if you also look at the whole operation, which means load and so forth, you probably have got 30 to 50% net energy gain, which can be used off-site or for some other operations. I try to, how to say, I only have got costings from Germany, and ideally love to put costings to something like this here in Australia. So if anyone is interested, I'm keen to cooperate with you to really determine particularly income from energy generation, what's there, what do the electricity retailers pay, and so forth. So here are investment costs. This is an example for 18,000 tonne per annum, 5.5 million. I think this is a lot more telling, costs per tonne input, and at the end allowing composting treatment costs and also income from the sale of compost, while significantly reducing what the operators in Germany would get for energy. So this is just a rough approximation, but somewhere, say, between $60 and $70, including composting for an end product. And I would think this is not too far off what in-vessel composting facilities cost to run and to have a product ready for sale at the end. And therefore, to finish off, this is sort of the scenario for the future, that garden organics, food organics, and some liquids go into anaerobic digestion, and that would be really the heart of future operations. Woody material can go into energy generation, and then these two energy streams would go to the end user. But importantly also, it's in the digestion vessel only for 2 or 3 weeks, and then after that it's composted for another 4 or 6 weeks together with coarser or self-hauled garden organics. So not all the material is being digested, only really what's suitable, and the rest goes around it, and it's just co-composted at the end, and no difference at the end. It'll be certified compost, ready to go into urban or rural markets. And that's possibly the future. Thank you.